Shalom and welcome back to the Tea Table, my friends. It's good that you could join me today. Have you ever noticed a person, or maybe you are the person, that had so many good qualities, but there was just a small problem that seemed to stick out like a sore thumb? I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, one of my best friends had what they call the wandering eye, which is really an issue with a muscle that controls the eye movement. It was his right eye, to be exact. This friend was an honor student, a good musician, and an athlete, and as mentioned, one of my very good friends. The problem was, when I would speak to him, obviously looking right at him, every once in a while his right eye would begin to wander. And regardless of what we were talking about, when his right eye began to wander, it always caught my attention, and I would move my entire body to try to stay lined up with his right eye. The problem was, his left eye was looking at me, and his right eye would wander off to the right side of his socket, and I had an issue as to which eye I would try to focus on. In other words, he was a good friend, an honor student, a musician, and an athlete, but he had a problem. This reminded me of 2 Kings 5, verse 1, which tells us, "Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master, and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy." Just to be clear, although we can't know all the reasons that God allows disease into our lives, biblical leprosy is a powerful symbol reminding us of sin's spread and its horrible consequences. And people with biblical leprosy was one of the many scourges that the Israelites believed God had inflicted upon mankind in retribution for sins committed. Bearing a mark of leprosy often meant a life of alienation, because lepers were forced to live meager existences on the outskirts of civilization. It would seem that the qualities of Naaman were so impressive that the very thing, leprosy, which caused banishment from family and friends, was listed at the very bottom of his accomplishments. We see that Naaman, which in Hebrew means pleasantness, was 1. Commander of the army of the king of Aram. 2. He was a great man in the sight of his master. 3. He was highly regarded. That means he was highly viewed and observed, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. 4. He was a valiant soldier. 5. He was married. And at the bottom of his accomplishments we find 6. But he was a leper. Thank God for Naaman, because Naaman is an example for the will of God to save people who are considered by men as less than pious and unworthy of salvation. God views us so much differently than we view ourselves. We are told in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Interesting. People look at the outward appearance, and more often than not, after looking at the outward appearance, they make a judgment call based on what they see. Unfortunately, people don't look at the heart of the person, but what they look like, or what they own, or their education, or wealth, or who they hang around with. This is man's ways, not God's ways. You see, my friends, man is susceptible to temptation to do wrong, and often will act in his own interest. However, since God is not able to be tempted by any force, and acts on his own interest, which is the interest of all that he created, his ways are perfect and absolute and without error. If God looks at the heart, why is it that people get so caught up with the outward appearance, and not only caught up, but oftentimes making a very poor judgment call on a person without ever taking into consideration the abilities or capabilities of that person? Give you a good example, using the rationale of 2 Kings 5:1, but using the life of a person that was exciting, inspiring, very human, manly, morally challenging, and ongoing. But this person has a problem, don't we all? According to The Call of David by John Henry Newman, David, the son of a man in humble life and the youngest of his brothers, was chosen by Almighty God to be his special servant, to be a prophet, a king, a psalmist. He was anointed by Samuel to be all of this, and in due time he was brought forward by Almighty God, and as a first act of might, killed the heathen giant Goliath. You see, my friends, if we bring this right down to where the rubber meets the road in our own life, David was the son of a Bethlehemite, one among the families of Israel, with nothing apparently to recommend him to God. He was the youngest of his brothers and despised by them. He was sent to feed the sheep, and his father, I'm sure, loved him dearly, yet seemed to have thought very little of him. How do I know? Well, when Samuel came to Jesse at God's command in order to choose one of his sons from the rest, as God might direct him, Jesse didn't even bring David before him, though he did bring all his other children. You know, it would seem David was born to live and die amongst his sheep. His brothers were allowed to engage in occupations which the world thinks higher and more noble. 3 of them served as soldiers in the king's army, and in their arrogance looked down upon David. On his asking about Goliath, one of them said to him in 1 Samuel 17:28, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Let me say this, my friends. People may judge you based on any number of external qualities, but God looks at your heart and is well pleased with you. After all, He formed you to have a heart for Him. Like David's elder brother, some may say you have a wicked heart, but God says you have a heart that is for Him. And like Naaman, you may have a problem, but you are not the problem, because if God is for you, who can be against you? Your God-given abilities and capabilities will always stand out and outshine your faults and your problems. This is why we are told in Deuteronomy 28 verse 13, "The Lord will make you the head, not the tail." If you pay attention to the commands of the Lord your God that I give you this day and carefully follow them, you will always be at the top, never at the bottom. And with that, my friends, I leave you with this. Yevarechecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha. Ye'ed Adonai panavilecha vihunecha. Yisa Adonai panavilecha ve'yesemlecha shalom. The Lord bless you and protect you. The Lord cause the light of His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn all of His attention upon you and give to you His peace. God bless, my friends, and I'll see you again next week at the tea table.